So occasionally I get comments asking me, when are you going to start posting book reviews again? And I'll think to myself, I post book reviews? What are you talking about? I post book reviews. And then I look, and the last time I posted a review of a fiction book was over 6 months ago. So anyway, what's going to happen now is I'm going to ramble for a little while about one of the latest Brandon Sanderson novels, and I hope that's entertaining for you. And you might be thinking, Nathaniel, The Sunlit Man came out about a year ago. Why are you waiting this long to post a review? The reason is because Brandon Sanderson writes too fast. He writes too many books. He published, by my count, 5 books last year. That's too many books. I have stuff to do. In all honesty though, I have several book review videos planned out for the near future, so I'm going to be getting back into doing this more regularly. I hope that doesn't bother anyone who just came to my channel for the sketches. Most of this review is going to be pretty spoilery, so I'll put that warning there. I will add a few thoughts here for people who don't want any spoilers though. If you randomly clicked on this video and you're thinking to yourself, hey, I wonder if I should read something by this Brandon Sanderson guy. I wonder if this book would be a good place to start. It wouldn't be. Don't start here. This book is very much one of the most fan servicey books in the Cosmere, his shared universe, which I don't think is a bad thing, but it requires a lot of context to sort of appreciate it the way I think it's meant to be appreciated. You can read it as a standalone story, but it will be a lot weaker probably. It's sort of a weird transitional book, which is wedged between the Stormlight Archive, one of his other big series, and some other projects that haven't been announced yet and that he probably won't start working on for a very long time. It is technically a standalone story, but it's not really strong enough as a standalone story to be a great entry point into this universe, I think. There are much better entry points. Aside from that though, the positive and negative aspects of this book were, for me, fairly similar to the positive and negative aspects of many of Brandon Sanderson's books, and for that reason I'll be taking this opportunity to talk about some of the general aspects of Sanderson's writing aside from just this book. Namely, the strongest aspects of the book were definitely the creative world building and magic system and the interconnectedness of the story with all of his other stories and all of the theory crafting that you can do around that. The weakest aspects of the book were things like the dialogue and the prose and the overall sense of immersion in the story. But anyway, because this book is really a book written for Cosmere superfans, I want this review to be very spoilery, which is why I'm going to put a spoiler warning here for the entire rest of the video, because I'm just going to be talking about everything. Bye! I'm going to start off talking about some negatives, because I would rather end on a positive note, I guess. One thing about this book is that if you've read a lot of Sanderson's other books, which if you have read this book, you probably have read a lot of his other books, the plot structure is fairly simple to predict. I do like how mobile this story is, like how the entire story is centered around this lengthy chase sequence. A lot of Sanderson's stories just take place in one city or one small area, and so it was refreshing to see so much movement. But at the same time, regarding the actual structure of the plot, it's easy to get a sense at this point, if you've read a lot of Sanderson's books, to know when the plot twists are going to happen, when the major character moments are going to happen, when the big revelations or turning points are going to happen, when we're going to transition to the point in the story where the character has to start learning how to use the magic system and mastering it. The way that Sanderson's standalone novels usually start is they introduce a very unusual world with a genuinely cool premise. The premise in this book is very cool, don't get me wrong. But then what happens is the main character wanders around for a little while until they get introduced to a core group of characters, and then with that group of characters has to learn the magic system and figure out what's going wrong in the world, and then eventually there's some sort of big plot twist near the end, and then a moment where the character sort of gives up all hope and then rebounds and saves the day. I'm reducing it a lot, and it's like, yeah, that is the structure of a lot of stories in general, but the way that Sanderson writes, you can sort of tell when these big moments are going to happen, and that makes it a little bit less page-turnery for me. To his credit, Sanderson definitely does know what he's good at writing, and he seems to stick to this structure for a reason. He seems to know that people like to read these kinds of stories, and he's good at writing them, so he does that. But for a lot of these secret projects that came out last year, for example, Tress was the same way, it feels like he's sort of pulling the rug out from under you, where you get introduced to a story that seems very different from anything else in the Cosmere so far, and then by the time you get to page 200 or 300, the story has basically settled into a very familiar rhythm, and it's more or less like any other Cosmere story. That's not really that big of an issue though, because it's more or less to be expected from a Cosmere novel. Something that I did have a bigger problem with in this book in particular is Nomad. Nomad is Siegzil from the Stormlight Archive, and I was very excited to learn that because I love Siegzil. But the thing is, from the beginning of this book, I just didn't really buy the way he's portrayed here. At the beginning of the story, he crash lands onto this planet after apparently teleporting there, and is fighting for his life to survive for several chapters with no idea what's going on. And this is a pretty entertaining sequence, but the thing is, the way that he's acting near the beginning of this novel is sort of like, I want to say, discount Han Solo. I partly get that impression because the opening sequence of this novel is like very Star Wars coded, maybe a little bit too Star Wars coded for my taste. But the reason I say discount Han Solo is because this book desperately wants you to think at the beginning that Siegzil is this scoundrel, that he just doesn't care about anyone or anything, that he's just concerned for his own survival and that he'll do anything to survive. But it's pretty abundantly obvious that he's not those things. Sure, he's very tired and world-weary, but you never get the impression, even at the very beginning, that he doesn't care about other people. Like when he sees those people who are tied up to be sacrificed to the sun at the very beginning, he can't save them. He doesn't try to save them because he can't, but he clearly sympathizes with them. He thinks this is like a horrible thing. And then almost immediately, he stumbles into a group of rebels that are trying to overthrow an evil dictator, and he joins them and decides to help them. Yet throughout all this, we have these moments where it's almost like Sanderson is thinking, oh yeah, we have to make Siegzil seem kind of like a scoundrel now, so we'll have him do something like sit back at a desk and put his chairs up on the table like a real bad boy. And then he just doesn't do anything like that for the rest of the book. It's weird. This characterization doesn't come across as natural. It feels like the character is playing a part, which, like, yeah, you know, there's nothing wrong with having a protagonist who is full of contradictions, who is playing a part, who doesn't realize that he's a better person than people say he is or than he thinks he is. But in the case of this book, the inconsistency with Siegzil's character doesn't just stem from inner conflict, it seems to stem from directorial conflict, so to speak. One of the major problems I consistently come across in Brandon's body of work is that character development is often given in the form of long paragraphs and lengthy internal monologues, where instead of showing us through a character's actions how they behave or how they react to different circumstances, we're basically just told again and again how a character has changed and how they think about themselves. It gets to the point where every character is like almost comically introspective. In the case of this book, we get all these scenes where Siegzil very early on is thinking about the mechanics of this planet, how the sun works, how the sun hearts work, and all of this. And every time he starts to get into it, he thinks to himself, no, I'm not that person anymore. I can't do that anymore. And it's like, why? At a certain point, the way he just constantly interrupts his own thoughts to remind himself that he's a different person now, that he's changed, it comes across as very annoying. Look, I get it. You have a balancing act here, where Siegzil is a very beloved character, and you don't want him to actually be a scoundrel. But at the same time, he has to have a character arc in this book, so you have to have him realize that he's a better person than he thought he was. I get it. But I can't help but thinking that maybe this character arc would be stronger if Sanderson just let Siegzil actually be kind of bad, if he let him be kind of a bad guy. Part of the problem here, I think, is that this book takes place over a very short time period. It's like 24 hours, maybe, I'm not sure. And so it just feels a little unbelievable to me that at the beginning of this book, Siegzil is constantly thinking to himself, I'm such a horrible person. I abandon everyone I care about, even though the whole reason he's on the run is to protect the people he cares about back on Roshar. And then at the end of this book, he's kind of relearned his protective instincts and remembered why he became a Knight Radiant in the first place, even though those protective instincts were clearly there at the beginning of the story. It's insane because at this point, he has been traveling for, what, decades? Possibly centuries? And yet all of this character development, all of these big moments happen in such a short time period. Now, I get why Sanderson did this too, because as I said earlier, I do like how this book is structured like a big long chase sequence. And if it took place over a longer period of time, it would take away from that. It would feel less frantic. But maybe this is just a case of him trying to have his cake and eat it too. It feels like this book is a piece of a much larger story, which clearly it is supposed to be, but it is also trying to be a complete story on its own. And that's a really, really difficult line to balance. Okay, now before I get on into the positives, of which there are many, I really did like this book. I want to talk a bit about one more thing, because the more of Sanderson's books I read, the more this is bugging me. And it's the prose. And I already know what people are going to say, because this is one of the most common criticisms Sanderson's books get. You might say, well, Sanderson writes with the window pane style of prose. You know, the prose is not supposed to draw attention to itself. It's not supposed to be quote-unquote flowery. which I could do a whole video about how much I dislike the term flowery prose, but that's a subject for another time. The thing is, in a lot of ways, I don't think Sanderson's prose is very much like a window pane. It draws attention to itself in ways that take me out of the story occasionally, and that makes reading these books a lot less fun than they could be. One of the problems is the somewhat colloquial language often used in these books. For example, this book includes one instance of the word cringeworthy. Cringeworthy belongs to that rare subset of words of which sesquipedalian is also a member. In other words, it exemplifies itself. Cringeworthy is just a bad word. I've never heard anybody use that word in real life. It's not something people say. It's not something you put down in writing. And above all, it's very much a modern term that is associated with the internet and cringe culture. Why? It's not a good word. And I already know what people are gonna say. They're gonna say, Nathaniel, are you gonna say that we shouldn't have the word volcano in fantasy books because people in this world don't worship the god Vulcan? Are you just completely ignoring that every word has an etymological root in real world history? No, of course not. The reason this annoys me is because in fantasy, you can use the English language in different ways to approximate different ways of speaking, even in a fictional world. In Tolkien's world, for instance, characters who are ancient, like the elves or the wizards, use more archaic language, and this makes them sound old, even though the language they're using doesn't exist in the world of Middle-earth. I dislike including words like cringeworthy in really any novel, but especially in epic fantasy, because these are big, bombastic stories about the preciousness of life and honor and the bonds we have to other people. And whenever a word like cringeworthy shows up in a book like this, it's almost the equivalent of when a boom mic shows up in a movie. You just think, oh yeah, this is all fake. It just takes me out of the story. This is also why I think this book and the other Cosmere books deserve to have more sensory detail in them. A lot of Sanderson's sentences are constructed in such similar ways that they seem to lack intention and forcefulness. And when it comes to adjectives, Sanderson again and again uses very generic, bland words like incredible, awesome, beautiful, terrible, horrendous. I think a story that's this epic deserves a little bit more zest in its vocabulary. It's especially weird when characters in these books will have these very awkward exchanges where one of them will walk up to the other and say something like, "That was beautiful," or "That sounds horrendous." Especially the word horrendous catches me off guard. I've never heard anyone say that in a normal conversation in real life. Look, I get it. I'm socially awkward too. I'm the kind of person who would stand around using generic adjectives because I'm not good with my mouth. I don't know what to say in social situations. But when you're reading a book, I want the dialogue to be a little bit more interesting. I don't like that the visual aesthetic of this world, Canticle, depends so much on the illustrations in the book. I love the illustrations in this book, they're fantastic. But the book itself is so sparse on descriptions of what we're seeing. Aside from descriptions of how the magic system works, of which there are plenty, we have a very good idea of how the magic in this world works. But in terms of how stuff looks, how it sounds, how it smells, how it feels, there's just not enough of that. At the risk of going on too long about this subject, I just want to give one example just to kind of illustrate my point. I'm going to read a very brief passage from a scene late in this book. This is the scene where Zellion and the members of Beacon show up at the Scadrian base, which they've been trying to reach for the entire book. It is a huge watershed moment in the story. Like, this is the big MacGuffin that they've been chasing after, this supposed stronghold beneath the earth where the Scadrians are. So it should be kind of a huge moment for them to reach this base. But this is the description of the base when we actually get to it. The door opens, and Zellion saw exactly what he'd feared. A large room, capsule-shaped, with workstations set through it and monitors on the walls. There would be 2 more levels beneath this one for activities and one for quarters. It was big enough for the 24 people who crewed it, but it was no giant sanctuary. That's all the description you get of this place. There are a couple passages later on that describe sounds like the beeping of the monitors and briefly mention that the Scadrians are wearing jeans and t-shirts, but aside from that, there's nothing. Like, you don't get a good idea of what this place looks like. I understand that Siegzil has been in places like this before, so it's probably nothing remarkable for him, but for the Beaconites, this is a huge deal. Like, this is a legendary place that they're visiting. They're literally stumbling upon an alien civilization. I would be in this situation taking into account literally everything. For example, you have all these people cooped up in a small space. What does it smell like in there? Does it smell terrible? Or is anyone eating food? Are they cooking instant noodles? Is there anything in the room to humanize the room's occupants? Like, do people have pictures of their family there? Are the workstations messy, or are they kept clean? What do the desks look like? What do the computers look like? I just really dislike how in a lot of Sanderson's books, a room is just a room, a hallway is just a hallway, a building is just a building. You get these words describing the sort of building blocks of daily life, but there's not enough zest in the descriptions to differentiate one building from another building, except in the most utilitarian way possible when it's relevant to the plot. I don't just want sensory information that's relevant to the plot. I want to be completely immersed in this world. Because of how sparse the descriptions in this book are, I feel like the book is best read when you're reading it quickly, which maybe is fine. Maybe that's what Sanderson is going for. Maybe he doesn't want the description to get in the way of figuring out what's going to happen next. But for me personally, I really like books that just immerse you in the world completely. And for all I love the Sanderlanches and the drama and the epic action, I wish these books were more immersive. So that was all a lot of negatives. But now I want to get on to the positives, because despite everything I just said, I liked this book more than I disliked it. Surprise, surprise, I've read every book in the Cosmere up until this point, and I also liked this one. There's a reason I've read all the Cosmere books, and that's because I think they're very fun to read. I already mentioned how I love the chase sequence element in this book, but the thing I really loved is the way that the characters have to frantically overcome these massive engineering problems. Like I already said, I was worried at the beginning of this book that the setting felt a little bit too Star Wars-esque. I don't want the Cosmere to just become Star Wars, but with Allomancers. I want it to be its own unique thing with its own unique flavor. Fortunately, I needn't have worried. I don't know why I ever doubted Sanderson. This book is really nothing like Star Wars, and I think one of the main reasons for that is because Sanderson actually clearly put in a lot of effort to understanding astrophysics, to understanding the engineering problems involved in making a steam-powered jet engine that can lift a hovercraft over a mountain. There's obviously a lot of fantasy stacked on top of it, and he clearly thought a lot about the magic system as well, but he goes out of his way to make this stuff sound plausible. And you would never get that in a Star Wars movie. In Star Wars, if Han and Leia are able to walk outside in a normal gravity environment on the surface of an asteroid wearing only breathing masks over their face to protect themselves from the vacuum of space, then you're just supposed to say, oh yeah, that's cool, that's fine, it's Star Wars. In the Cosmere, if something like this happens, then you're clearly supposed to notice how weird this stuff is. You're supposed to think, oh wow, the center of this asteroid must be so invested, which is causing it to have a massive gravitational pull. In the case of Canticle, you're supposed to notice that the sun superheating one side of the planet at all times is going to cause massive destructive storms on the other side of the planet. In other words, Sanderson has a lot of faith in the reader to be able to follow along with the magic systems that he creates and to understand the implications of all the rules that he creates. I know that some people dislike this aspect of Sanderson's writing because they say it takes away from the magic of the magic if you explain it in too much detail. But personally, I think this is the reason why I read Sanderson's books as opposed to those of other fantasy authors who I might read for other reasons. In the Cosmere, magic is essentially just another layer of physics. It functions according to the laws of physics in our universe, but there's just like more stuff added on top of it. And some of that stuff is a little bit weird and esoteric, like cognitive and spiritual stuff. So it sounds magic-y, but there are still like predictable patterns, and you have to memorize those patterns and understand them in order to understand what's going on in the story. That makes it sound really intense. It's not like hard to understand or anything. It's just that Sanderson respects the reader to be able to follow along and to be able to ask intelligent questions about the story and the world building before he brings up those questions himself. Now, do I think it was a little bit unrealistic for them to be able to retrofit all the jet engines of this hover city with steam-powered counterparts so that it could get over this mountain in a matter of hours? Yeah, maybe a little bit, especially since at the beginning of this whole sequence, Siegzil didn't even know about the choir and its ability to manufacture engines and anything they give it based off of blueprints. I'm confused as to why he thought this challenge was even tractable before he knew about that. But at the end of the day, it's whatever. The whole sequence where Beacon was flying over the mountain and where Nomad had to do emergency repairs on the underside of the city as they were, you know, past the atmosphere, that was probably my favorite sequence of the book. It was gripping. It read like a thriller. It was a fun time. It reminded me of movies like Apollo 13 or The Aeronauts, you know, these stories about people overcoming massive engineering problems in the upper atmosphere in order to save their lives. I love those kind of stories. I like how Sanderson also constantly seems to be trying to outdo himself and how nightmarish he can make these Cosmere planets. Especially the ones that the Threnodites live on for some reason. We already have planets where you have to abuse people emotionally and physically in order for them to get magic powers, and so there are like systematized ways of crushing people's spirits in order to turn them into superheroes. But now we have a planet where people have to be ritually sacrificed to the sun in order to keep yourself alive. Does he hate his characters, or what is he doing? Speaking of human sacrifice, the Cinder King was such a funny villain in this book because it's obvious from the first time you meet him that he's such a midwit. He's so dumb compared to Siegzil, but he thinks he's all that. He thinks that he's this grand evil tyrant, and just like the book doesn't take him seriously at all, and Siegzil doesn't take him seriously at all, and I quite like that. I like that we have a minor villain who you don't have to take too seriously, even though he does some pretty despicable stuff, enough to make you hate him at the same time as mocking him. His monologuing did occasionally push the boundary on the cheesiness level I'm willing to tolerate, but, you know, it's probably supposed to be cheesy. This is a fundamentally stupid person. Of course, I have to talk about the fan service too, because the fan service in this book is everywhere, and that's intentional. Sanderson said that this was the fan service book more than any other book in the Cosmere, and I love that. Siegzil is Zellion. I somehow didn't get that spoiled for me. In the entire year since this book has come out, I did not get that spoiled for me. The name Zellion was originally revealed during a Kickstarter campaign like last year or something, and nobody knew what Zellion meant. I thought it was going to be a character in the Stormlight Archive, so now I'm glad I read this book before the next Stormlight Archive book comes out. Otherwise, I would be in that review. I'd be like, who is Zellion? We were all promised this character named Zellion in the next book, and then everyone in the comments would think I was an idiot. This book definitely does have major implications for the next Stormlight book as well, because apparently Siegzil broke his oaths, maybe? Or he lost his bond with his honor sprint, and now he's a Skybreaker, apparently. And also he took up a Dawn Shard, apparently. What's going on? What's going to happen to him in the next book? I love the little bits of Roshar lore we did get in this book, like especially the story. He tells the Aegis story about the Alethi and how they were these giants who climbed up to the sun. It's so cool to see the Alethi culture from a different perspective, and to see the name. They even have a different name for Alethi culture in the Aegis language. The main Stormlight Archive books are very Alethkar focused, and it's kind of funny that now that we're in the space age of the Cosmere, the stereotype about Rosharans seems to be mostly a stereotype about Alethi people. So it is nice to get a different perspective on Roshar for once. Surprisingly though, the aspect of this book that I ended up liking perhaps more than anything else was Elegy's story. I really liked Elegy's story in this book, and in particular, the bittersweetness of her having to come to terms with the fact that she used to be a completely different person with a completely different personality and different values, and having to reconstruct a new identity for herself on top of that. Throughout this book, we get all these little moments of Elegy reflecting on this subtle tragedy of her losing her memories and recognizing that the people around her see her as somebody other than who she sees herself as. She sees that the Elegy she used to be was this great, honorable person beloved by everyone, and now she's become this monster. But rather than either completely disregarding that old identity and embracing her new one, or forming a new identity by replicating her old one as much as possible, she threads the line between these two extremes and is forced to construct a new identity for herself in the absence of all her previous memories, knowing the person she used to be is different from who she is now. I liked this because I was worried at a certain point that Sanderson would just give her back her memories. He would take the easy route and avoid this conflict altogether. One of my main criticisms of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is that there were a couple moments in that book where we had the opportunity for some really interesting conflict, and instead we got kind of the easy way out. Especially at the end of the book, there were a couple moments like that. The ending of this book doesn't do that. Elegy is forced to construct this new identity, while Rebecca is forced to acknowledge that her old sister is dead, and now she has to come to terms with this new person who also shares the same body as her sister. Meanwhile, there's this real bittersweetness to Zellion's side of the story as well, because Ox is truly dead at the end of this book. Zellion is still on the run. Nothing has really changed regarding his relationship with the Night Brigade. And regarding the state of the Cosmere as a whole, it seems like there are still all these actors everywhere who are working for their own nefarious, greedy ends, especially the Scadrians, who just don't care about anyone. The book is clearly supposed to be reminiscent of Westerns in its overall plot structure, and how you have this man with no name showing up and saving this group of people and then vanishing off into the wilderness on his trusty steed, which in this case is a dead spren. I like the bittersweetness of this ending, although it makes me a little sad to know that we probably won't know what happened to Sigzil next for a very, very, very long time. This book is almost like a teaser trailer for the rest of the Cosmere in some ways, but I do think these types of long stories are a lot better when the individual episodes in the story are left unresolved. So I liked the ending of this book. I have to say though, one thing I don't like, or one person I don't like, is Hoid. I am a Hoid hater now. Hoid is really the main villain of the story when you think about it, because he's the one who causes all of Sigzil's problems. He just goes up to my boy Sigzil, gives him a Dawn Shard, and he's like, yeah, just take this. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. You know, it's for the good of the Cosmere or whatever. And then the Dawn Shard kills his spren and sends the Night Brigade chasing after him. And then even when he gives up the Dawn Shard, the Night Brigade is still chasing him because they want to turn him into a hemalurgic spike and use his connection to the Dawn Shard to find it. Hoid has essentially thrust Sigzil into this never-ending nightmare from which he can never escape. And then when Hoid shows up in this book, he's just like, oh yeah, sorry, I may have messed up there, my bad. Anyway, I have to go make instant noodles or something. See you later. Just, what a truly garbage human being. Every time Hoid shows up in the Cosmere books, there's always like one world hopper who thinks, ugh, that guy, Siphondrius. I hate him. And I always thought, why do you hate Hoid? He's such a quirky little guy. He tells stories. Now I see why people hate Hoid. Sure, he tells stories sometimes when he feels like it, and other times he just ruins people's lives. What a truly slippery, frustrating, and selfish person. I'm a Hoid hater. I don't know what to say. I won't vote for Hoid for president. Anyway, I hope this review wasn't too long. I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble. Please let me know if you agree or disagree with me on any of these individual points. And I'm gonna say this now so I can be held accountable for it. I will try to get out another book review within the next 1 to 2 weeks. Genuinely, I'm going to try to do more of these. I read a lot of books and then just don't make videos on them, so I'm gonna start making more videos on them. And I just hope that the people who watch my other content will also watch these things. Anyway, thank you so much for turning into the generic channel, and have a great day.